Something strange began unfolding across North America's rail yards in the late 2000s, and most people driving past chain link fences never realized they were looking at one of the biggest industrial shifts in modern transportation history. Brand new locomotives worth millions sat nose to tail in long, silent rows. Paint still glossy, engines cold, wheels slowly oxidizing under open skies, while freight trains that remained in service grew longer and heavier than anything seen before. Behind those quiet machines stood one executive whose ideas reshaped an entire industry and whose final months marked the moment when thousands of working locomotives were deliberately taken out of service. December 2017 brought an image that railroad veterans still talk about in low voices. In Jacksonville, Florida, at CSX headquarters, Ewing Hunter Harrison was carried out on a stretcher after months of visible decline, and within 48 hours, he was gone, leaving behind a company that had been radically altered in less than a year and an industry that had already begun following his blueprint. Rows of locomotives across the United States and Canada were parked in storage tracks, lined up like museum pieces, even though many had years of service left in them. And trains that once required multiple sets of power were now being stretched to extraordinary lengths so that fewer departures could haul the same freight. By the time of his death, Harrison had transformed 4 major railroads, enriched shareholders beyond expectations, and set in motion the largest consolidation of active locomotive fleets the continent had ever seen. To understand how one executive convinced an entire sector to embrace what once sounded absurd, it helps to go back to 1963, when a 19-year-old from Memphis walked into a St. Louis-San Francisco railway yard and took the lowest job available as a carman oiler, crawling beneath freight cars to grease bearings and inspect components that kept the system moving. That young worker, E. Hunter Harrison, entered railroading at a time when tradition ruled operations and excess capacity was considered a form of security. Yet over decades, he climbed through the ranks at Frisco and later Burlington Northern and developed a blunt belief that the industry was bloated with underused assets and outdated habits that drained profit without improving service. By the late 1980s, Harrison had shaped a philosophy that cut against the instincts of many railroaders who valued flexibility and redundancy, yet arguing that railroads owned too many locomotives, kept too many freight cars dwelling in yards, and employed too many people waiting for work that did not always materialize. In 1989, he joined Illinois Central as vice president and chief operating officer and found a carrier struggling with an operating ratio in the high 90s, meaning nearly every dollar earned was consumed by costs, leaving shareholders with almost nothing. Over 4 years, he drove that ratio down into the low 60s, a level that stunned the industry, largely by introducing fixed schedules that treated freight trains more like airline departures, leaving at set times whether fully loaded or not, and by removing locomotives, cars, and positions he deemed unnecessary for keeping those scheduled trains moving. The financial transformation at Illinois Central turned heads, and in 1998, Canadian National Railway recruited Harrison to apply the same discipline across a vast network that stretched from coast to coast. Canadian National was not a minor regional line in need of rescue. It was one of the largest railroads in North America, yet within 16 months, Harrison had eliminated 600 trains from the schedule and sidelined roughly 35% of the locomotive fleet, parking units that still had significant remaining life because they were not constantly in use. The numbers that followed were dramatic, as CN's operating ratio dropped from 89% in 1998 to 61% by 2006, the lowest among Class 1 railroads, while its stock climbed from under $5 to more than $27 during that period, turning Harrison into a legend on Wall Street. On paper, the model looked unstoppable, though reactions beyond investor circles were more complicated as shippers began reporting inconsistent service and smaller routes were trimmed if they failed to meet profitability targets. Communities that once relied on regular rail connections watched certain lanes disappear, and workers faced reductions as efficiency became the central measure of success. Harrison retired from CN in 2009 with a reported $40 million in benefits and a reputation as the premier turnaround architect in the sector. Yet retirement did not last long, because in 2012, Pershing Square Capital Management launched a proxy battle to install him as chief executive at Canadian Pacific Railway. The takeover at Canadian Pacific was aggressive and public, and ending with Harrison assuming control and rapidly announcing cuts that included 195 locomotives and 3,200 leased freight cars, along with relocating the company's headquarters out of downtown Calgary to reduce costs. Over the following years, Canadian Pacific's operating ratio fell from above 80% to below 60%, and its stock price more than tripled, while roughly 600 additional locomotives were placed into storage across Canada and the northern United States because longer, heavier trains allowed similar freight volumes to move with fewer active units and fewer employees. As Canadian Pacific's financial metrics improved, executives at rival railroads faced pointed questions from their own shareholders about why comparable gains were not being achieved elsewhere. By March 2017, Harrison accepted his final leadership role at CSX in the eastern United States, and the changes there unfolded with unprecedented speed, as more than 900 locomotives were parked within months, 26,000 freight cars were removed from service, 7 of 12 hump yards were closed or converted, and plans were announced to cut nearly a third of the 31,000-person workforce. CSX's operating ratio fell from close to 70% to under 60%, and the stock price jumped 23% in a single day when Harrison's appointment became public, adding roughly $8 billion in market value before operational shifts were fully implemented. Harrison's passing in December 2017 raised immediate questions about whether precision scheduled railroading, the term often used to describe his system, would endure without his direct oversight. Yet the industry's response was swift. Union Pacific introduced Unified Plan 2020, Norfolk Southern launched Top 21, and Kansas City Southern implemented comparable strategies, leaving BNSF Railway as the only major Class 1 that did not fully adopt the framework. Between 2017 and 2020, the total locomotive fleet of U.S. Class 1 railroads declined from more than 26,000 to under 24,000, a reduction of roughly 3,000 machines, while the workforce shrank by about 45,000 employees, representing a 28% drop that left leaner crews managing longer trains and larger territories. Norfolk Southern alone removed 703 locomotives from active service, about 22% of its fleet, and recorded a $385 million non-cash charge to write down equipment that still had useful life remaining. Union Pacific stored more than 2,100 locomotives in desert yards across the American West, placing million-dollar assets in long lines because fewer departures with extended consists were considered more efficient. These decisions delivered improved operating ratios and higher share prices, yet complaints to the Surface Transportation Board increased as shippers reported missed pickups, delayed deliveries, and difficulty securing equipment during surges in demand. By April 2022, the Surface Transportation Board convened a 2-day hearing to examine deteriorating service conditions, and testimony described trains stretching beyond infrastructure limits, maintenance crews reduced to levels that complicated routine inspections, and pressure to maintain low operating ratios even when service faltered. Martin Oberman, then chairman of the STB, noted that Class 1 railroads had reduced their workforce by roughly 29%, or 45,000 employees, over 5 years, linking those cuts to the broader supply chain disruptions affecting industries from agriculture to chemicals. The debate over efficiency and resilience intensified on February 3, 2023, when a Norfolk Southern freight train derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, forcing evacuations and releasing hazardous materials into the surrounding environment. The train measured approximately 9,300 feet in length, weighed about 18,000 tons, and was operated by a crew of 3, consisting of an engineer, a conductor, and a trainee. It carried 150 cars, including 20 loaded with hazardous materials, and investigators later determined that an overheating wheel bearing had been detected by wayside systems, yet did not trigger an earlier stop under existing protocols, leading to a catastrophic failure that caused cars to pile up and tanks to rupture. Norfolk Southern ultimately committed more than $1 billion to cleanup and compensation, and its chief executive faced congressional scrutiny, while the National Transportation Safety Board cited multiple shortcomings in safety culture and procedures. Supporters of precision-scheduled railroading argued that derailments have occurred throughout railroad history and that the event could not be attributed solely to cost-cutting, yet critics, including labor unions and shippers who had complained for years about service reliability, contended that running longer trains with smaller crews while sidelining thousands of locomotives and reducing staff inevitably narrowed safety margins and increased systemic risk. Harrison did not witness these developments, nor did he answer for the broader consequences of the philosophy he championed, because his final chapter closed in late 2017, with his reputation among investors largely intact and his methods embedded across nearly every major freight carrier. As of 2026, the core principles he promoted continue to guide operations, with railroads moving roughly 40% of America's freight under systems designed to maximize asset utilization, minimize idle equipment, and prioritize operating ratios that appeal to financial markets. The central tension remains unresolved because railroads occupy a dual role as publicly traded corporations, accountable to shareholders, and as critical infrastructure responsible for supporting national commerce and community safety. Thousands of locomotives that were removed from daily service during the wave of precision-scheduled railroading remain stored in various yards, symbols of a strategic choice to consolidate power into fewer, longer trains rather than maintain larger fleets ready for fluctuating demand. Advocates describe the transformation as a necessary modernization that strengthened balance sheets and positioned carriers for competitive pressures, while critics see an industry operating closer to its limits, with less redundancy available when disruptions occur. E. Hunter Harrison's journey from greasing wheel bearings in Memphis to leading 4 major railroads illustrates how a single executive's conviction can ripple across an entire sector, reshaping practices that had endured for generations and aligning them with a financial logic that rewards lean operations. Whether that legacy represents disciplined innovation or a gamble with long-term resilience depends on perspective, yet the parked locomotives remain visible reminders of the scale of change, silent lines of steel that once powered daily commerce and now stand as evidence of a sweeping recalibration of how railroads measure success. Across North America, the system he molded continues to chase efficiency targets and shareholder returns, operating longer trains with fewer crews and keeping reserve power in storage rather than on standby, even as regulators, communities, and industry insiders debate the balance between cost control and safety. The locomotives that were sidelined have not vanished. They sit in storage tracks, waiting for a strategic reversal that may never arrive, while freight corridors handle immense volumes with leaner margins for error.